just shooting back.
Hail of gunfire as SWAT teams storm a Florida nightclub.
I don't know where my son is. No one can tell me where my son is.
A lone gunman inside on a shooting spree. When it was over, 49 victims lay dead, another 53 wounded. The question is, why? Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. It's the deadliest mass shooting in United States history. Eyewitnesses paint a chilling picture of what happened inside a gay nightclub in Orlando, Florida. A gunman, later identified as 29-year-old Omar Mateen, armed with an assault rifle, began randomly shooting. During a 3-hour standoff with police, he called 911, the police emergency helpline, calmly pledging his allegiance to Islamic State. In the end, fearing Mateen was also armed with explosives, police stormed the building, freeing hostages and killing the shooter. Later, we'll talk with several experts about what might have motivated the attack. But first, we turn to CCTV's Sean Calebs, who is in Orlando. And Sean, what's the latest on the investigation?
Well, Anand, I can tell you the federal authorities are right now basically trying to connect the dots. They say that they believe Mateen is, quote, a homegrown extremist. That is what they are looking at. It is true, once he was in the building and called 911, he did pledge his allegiance to ISIL as well as its leader. But it gets a little more confusing to that if you listen to the director of the FBI. They say that also Mateen had a more than passing acquaintance with a U.S. citizen who worshiped at the same mosque as he did, about 180 kilometers to the southwest of here. And that U.S. citizen later went on to Syria and died in a suicide blast. And al-Nusra is an enemy against the Islamic State. And secondly, during the 911 call, Mateen also pledged his support to the 2 bombers involved in the Boston Marathon attack as well. So federal authorities say they're trying to determine exactly which extremist organization that he did have his loyalties to. But there's much more concern than that as well. We do know that on 2 separate occasions, once back in 2013, once in 2014, the FBI did investigations into Mateen's background after his colleagues, where he worked as a security guard, questioned some threats that he made that could have been taken as terrorist threats. Those investigations went nowhere. He was not put on a terror watch, and a lot of people are simply furious in this area that Mateen was able to buy a semi-automatic assault rifle, the same kind basically that the U.S. military uses in war, walk into the nightclub behind me and just unleash his brand of terror. On it?
Sean, 53 people were wounded in this attack. Do we know anything about their conditions right now?
We don't know a great deal. We do know that at least 5 of those individuals were gravely injured, and authorities are concerned about the loss of life going up. And also, there's just some heartbreaking stories going out. We know that the investigators who were in there in the very difficult hours in the aftermath talked about hearing cell phones ringing and ringing and ringing. Those are phones that victims had simply dropped where they lay, and their loved ones were trying to reach them. And there's also some video going around. This was the end of a Gay Pride Week. It was supposed to be a great night of celebration, Latin night at the Pulse. And there was a Snapchat video being taken right when the attack happened. And sadly, the young 25-year-old woman who took that video passed away. So there are simply heartbreaking stories that are coming out here, and we're no doubt going to hear more in the coming days as doctors continue to try and save the lives of those still listed in very serious condition.
Thanks, Sean. That's CCTV's Sean Calebs reporting from Orlando, Florida. Well, joining us now from Toronto is Haroon Siddiqui. He's the author of Being Muslim, the Toronto Star's editorial page editor emeritus, and the recipient of the Order of Canada, the country's highest civilian honor. With us here in Washington is political activist and radio talk show host Richard Fowler. And joining us in a few minutes from Orlando, where he's been covering the shooting, is Kevin Naff. He's the co-owner and editor of the Washington Blade, a leading LGBT community news publication. As I said, Kevin will be with us in a minute or so. But let's start with Haroon in Toronto. Haroon, the killer was identified by police as Omar Mateen, as I had mentioned, and as we also reported, he pledged allegiance to Islamic State in a telephone call to police. Now, implications of that expression of allegiance to Islamic State for the United States, how does it change things?
Anna, It doesn't quite change things. Anand, as your reporter was reporting correctly, that there is a whole series of confusing messages that have come out. He also, in those frantic last-minute phone calls that he made to 911, he allegedly proclaimed allegiance to or paid homage to the Boston Marathon bombers, to Hezbollah, to Al-Qaeda, to ISIS. So he has a confused murderer talking, that's one. Number two, as the FBI has been saying for 24 hours, and President Obama has just confirmed a few minutes earlier, that the FBI is not sure whether in fact there was a link to ISIS, whether he was simply making a statement. There is no established fact that ISIS was directing him, let alone train him. So this is at best a speculation, nothing beyond that statement, the confusing statements that he made.
Right, and Richard, that's an important difference that Haroon mentions there. He was not directed by ISIS from wherever it operates from, unlike the Paris bombers, for instance, who operated under the direct instructions of ISIS. He just said, I pledge allegiance to that. That's pretty
right,
important.
and I think that's what makes this story so horrifying, right? Because like Haroon is right, he did not pledge allegiance to ISIS, even though ISIS on their radio show today said, you know, they praised him for doing this and how great of an act this was, which is disgusting. But this is, to me, mired down and rooted in hate, right? And I think the president said it best in the White House spray today, where he talked about homegrown extremism. And for homegrown extremism to happen, it has to be fertile ground. And what we've seen over the past couple years, what we've seen in the past 6 months in this country is fertile ground for this type of hatred to grow. Right? His father, in an interview yesterday, indicated that his son was upset by seeing two men kissing, right? And that is based on this idea that there's been so much hate for the LGBTQ community, whether it be because of the North Carolina law that says transgendered folks can't use the bathroom that they identify as, whether it be all those states that have tried their hardest to push back against LGBTQ protections and making them a protected class, so they do qualify for discrimination benefits, or they do qualify if there's a hate crime against them. So this is what I would call perpetuated on a fertile ground of hate, and this is a result of it.
Well, we do have Kevin right now, and Kevin, you know,
Richard,
go ahead, Haroon.
No, Richard is quite right. You see, if you note some of these very extraordinary statements being made by Mr. Trump and all the right-wing Republicans and so on who are striking political poses, very few of them, or none of them, have expressed any sympathy or any kind of alignment with the LGBT community. You know, they are skirting around that issue. Some of these kinds of people have also been fanning hatred against the gay community for a long time. And just as Richard mentioned, there have been campaigns going on the washroom issue and other issues.
Yeah, that's right. They have condemned the shooting and the tragedy, but there's no link.
And I think that's part of the problem, Hanan.
They just walk around it, you see.
Yeah, what they've tried to do is decouple the fact that Pulse was an LGBTQ nightclub, right? And they said it's a terrorist act, but we're going to ignore the part about the fact that Pulse was an LGBTQ nightclub, which is problematic, because the ideal of a gay nightclub is a place that is safe and welcoming. It's a lot of times the first place you can live openly gay or openly lesbian or openly bisexual, or openly transgendered. It's the antithesis of what Republicans are trying to do, or what the far right is trying to do by trying to decouple those two things. These two things have to be seen together. This is a hate crime first, a terrorist act second, but a hate crime first.
Right.
Okay, let's bring Kevin in. Kevin, we heard from... one moment, Haroon. I'll get you in a moment. I just want to bring Kevin in. Kevin, we heard from our reporter just a moment ago on the investigation, but how is the city like Orlando coping with this right now, particularly the gay community?
Well, I saw a lot of hopeful signs today. I spent a good part of the day at the LGBT Community Center here in Orlando, and I didn't see a single tear shed. Most of the folks there are working hard. They are raising money through GoFundMe. They are collecting donations and distributing them to blood donation centers all around the city, where lines again today were long from people looking to do something, looking to give blood. So it was a very busy atmosphere, but the way several people explained it to me was they cried their tears out yesterday, and today it's back to work.
Haroon, you know, as we heard from Richard a moment ago, this was a hate crime first and then a terrorist act, but already we're seeing quite a bit of anti-Muslim rhetoric, especially among politicians as well. I mean, there's already a great deal of Islamophobia in the United States. this massacre is going to widen that gulf, isn't it?
Yes, of course.
I'm sorry, can you just repeat that last part?
Go ahead, Arun. Kevin, I'll get to you in a moment.
Politics. Yeah. Three kinds of politics are being played. One is to blame guns, which is the obvious thing. The second thing is to blame homophobia and so on. And the third one really is to blame Muslims and Islam and all the connections that come with it. When you look at this, you know, what do you see here? There's a context here. This is a homegrown terrorist, as we have seen homegrown radicalism in the United States and so on. And this is not happening out of context. Mr. Trump wants to ban Muslims from coming in. This man was a thoroughbred American, born in New York, was exercising his constitutional right to buy guns, even though he had a troubled record and FBI had already seen him. That's one part of it. Second part of it is, despite that record, he's allowed to buy guns legally. He's armed himself with a semi-automatic gun. This is a weapon of war. What is this weapon doing in the streets of America? But Americans are in denial. They don't want to deal with the issue of guns. You know, there was a story in the New York Times today. There are 65,000 gun dealers in the United States, and there are only 10,000 Starbucks. So it's 1 to 6. And the list goes on like that in a horrifying extent, how far this gun culture has perpetuated in the United States. And Mr. Trump and everyone else continues to invoke Second Amendment. Mr. Obama, the President of the United States, the most powerful leader supposedly in the world, has been helpless in trying to convince Congress to do anything about it. The third part of it really gets back to your question. A great diversionary tactic is to blame not just ISIS. ISIS is a murderous outfit. We know that, as was Al-Qaeda. But to lay collective guilt on almost all Muslims, which is what Mr. Turner is, which is what Mr. Trump has been doing.
Kevin, just to get back to the LGBT community in Orlando, as you pointed out, they're a very resilient community. They've come to terms with this tragedy very quickly. But have they been targeted before? Because by most accounts, Orlando is a pretty tolerant city, isn't it?
Yes, unfortunately, our community has a long history dealing with loss and grief. Of course, we came through the AIDS epidemic, but we've also suffered violent acts in bars and nightclubs all over the country and all over the world. There were 32 gay men who died in an attack on a gay bar in New Orleans in 1972. So 40 years later, we still have a long ways to go. I want to go back to what the other gentleman was saying about politics. I think it's also really important to remember that none of this happens in a vacuum.
Right.
We live in a culture that is drenched in violence and violent imagery and violent messages. And when you have a leading candidate for president openly extolling violence and calling for violence and offering to pay the legal bills of people at his rallies who beat people up, himself expressing that he wants to punch someone in the face. I mean, these things contribute to a society that we live in now that is just completely saturated in violence. And the bully pulpit is a real thing. It has power, and people listen. And I just hope that one of the positive outcomes of this would be that we could elevate our discourse in this country at least at the presidential level. And as far as these politicians who are coming out with their statements of support, that's nice and cute, but many of those same politicians have done everything that they could while they were in the Senate, for example, Marco Rubio, to undermine and sabotage advances in LGBT rights. There is a bill that would ban discrimination in employment in this country that has languished in Congress since 1974, and all of the Republicans continue to oppose it. You know, talk is nice, and those sentiments are fine and appropriate, I suppose, but it's really what you do that counts, not what you say.
I think that's exactly right, Hanan, and I think Kevin is exactly right on that point. I think you have to couple these together. If you hear what Hanan is saying and what Kevin is saying, you couple them together. What you've seen over the past couple of weeks has been an outpouring of support from the Muslim community. Muslims have come out, both in CAR, other groups have said, we do not condone these actions. We are with the people of the LGBTQ community. We stand with them. What has been missing to me, and what I have not seen, is where are all those folks? Where's the Family Research Council? Where are all the far-right Christian conservatives who believe that, you know, thou shalt not murder? They've been absent from this dialogue, which speaks to me to say that these are two groups that they both hate they hate the gays and they hate the Muslims, and so they're like, well, we're just not going to deal with it at all. And you've heard nothing from them. None of the outspoken folks. The only folks you've heard from is the 700 Club, Pat Robinson, who said, this is exactly what I told you is going to happen. The gays are going to take us all back to hell. And so it really speaks to the fact that we have created fertile ground in this country for hatred. People have used the Bible to do it. People have used the political bully pulpit to do it. People have used the halls of Congress to do it, to re-entrench these ideals that it's okay to discriminate against a group of people. And what makes this story so telling and makes it so awful is how it happened, right? It happened on Latino night, right? And if you take us back to a couple decades ago, and you talk about the Stonewall riots, which was led by African American and Latino LGBTQ activists, you say to yourself, after all the changes we've made, the fact that we now have a black man in the White House, the fact that now marriage equality is the law of the land, yet still a trans woman can get killed right here in Washington, D.C., and nobody cares about it. And the only reason why I think we're telling this story is because they found a way to connect it to another group of people that they don't like, which is a Muslim individual, who I would argue this guy's not Muslim because this is not what the Muslim faith preaches at all.
Okay, lots more to talk about, but we are going to take a break right now. More on this tragedy in Orlando right after that. Stay with us. You're watching The Heat.
Biggest challenges we are going to have is this kind of propaganda and perversions of Islam that you see generated on the internet, and the capacity for that to seep into the minds of troubled individuals.
That was U.S. President Barack Obama reacting to the mass shooting in Orlando by a self-proclaimed supporter of ISIL, or Islamic State. Welcome back. Reaction to the mass shooting has come from around the world and across the political spectrum. For that part of our show, let's go to Jim Spellman. He's in our newsroom. Jim?
Hey, Anand. China's Premier Li Keqiang offered condolences to the U.S. after the attack, saying China opposes all terrorism. Iran's foreign minister condemned the attack. Russia's President Vladimir Putin called the attack barbaric, and U.S. allies around the world also condemning the attack. Here in the U.S., the attack has become a political flashpoint. U.S. presidential nominees, that would be Republican Donald Trump and the Democrat Hillary Clinton. Trump accused Clinton of downplaying the threat of terrorism, calling her out for not using the words, quote, radical Islam. Clinton has now begun using that language, and she struck a more hardline tone in a speech Monday, saying jihadist groups would like to, quote, take us all back to the Stone Age. Trump renewed his calls to block Muslims from entering the United States. Clinton rejects that idea.
When I'm elected, I will suspend immigration from areas of the world where there is a proven history of terrorism against the United States, Europe, or our allies, until we fully understand how to end these threats.
Threatening to ban the families and friends of Muslim Americans, as well as millions of Muslim business people and tourists from entering our country, hurts the vast majority of Muslims who love freedom and hate terror.
More disagreement on guns. Trump's calling for continued easy acts here in the United States. Clinton calling for some modest gun control reforms. Clinton expressed solidarity with the LGBT community, saying she is a longtime supporter. Many Republicans have downplayed or even refused to acknowledge that the victims in this attack are part of the LGBT community. Trump broke with them, saying the attacks are, quote, and a free people to live their lives, love who they want, and express their identity. We'll have to see where that part of this story goes. A little bit surprising to me, Anna, to hear Donald Trump speaking such welcoming words about the LGBT community.
Right, Jim. Thanks. That's CCTV's Jim Spellman reporting. And let me go to Kevin to get his reaction, what Donald Trump has been saying. So, Kevin, here we have a situation where there's been a massacre in this country. There's been a massive outpouring of grief for what happened in Orlando. And we're hearing a politician like Donald Trump, use this for his own political agenda here, saying that he's a better friend of women and the LGBT community than Hillary Clinton. It also says at the same time that his actions against Muslims is just because of that, because they don't share American values.
Donald Trump just proves over and over how thoroughly unqualified and unfit he is to be president. Where to begin unpacking that? I mean, first of all, as far as being a friend to the LGBT community, he has already said that he would nominate Supreme Court justices who would overturn the marriage equality ruling. He supports religious freedom bills. He opposes the Equality Act. I could go on and on. He has promised to undo his executive orders that have banned discrimination in the federal workforce and among federal contractors. It's a long list of promises he's made to undermine and roll back the progress that we have made under this president. As far as what he said about Muslims, he is so naive. He is playing right into the hands of the terrorists, and this is exactly what terrorists like bin Laden and others have openly said that they wanted to do, was to create this sort of us versus them paradigm, this, the West versus Islam. And what Trump is doing is playing into that and helping it to come into be. And the message that everyone here on the ground in Orlando had for me today was one of love, that we will respond with love, and we will not be deterred by hate from loving the person that we choose to love, and that's how we'll overcome this, and not with bans and not with hate speech.
Right, Haroon, go ahead.
Just to add to what Kevin is saying, I mean, Mr. Donald Trump is going to ban Muslims from all over the world to come to the United States. I, as a Muslim in Toronto, may not be welcome in the United States. I would welcome that because I would not want to go to the United States led by a Trump, but forget all of that. This man, this murderer, was born in the United States. He was a New York man who got radicalized and who bought the guns that the American Constitution allows him to buy. What are we talking about? We are so divorced from reality. Sitting in Toronto, in Canada, one looks at our friends in the United States and say, have they gone bonkers? Have they taken leave of reality? What is happening here? They want to blame, they want to fan homophobia on the one hand, then they keep quiet. Then they want to fan Islamophobia, then they keep quiet. They don't want to deal with the reality of gun control and what needs to be done. Second, none of the Republicans, not Mr. Trump, anyone wants to talk about where did ISIS come from? ISIS is the direct result of George W. Bush's invasion of an occupation and total crumbling of Iraq, which is where ISIS was born. Americans don't want to talk about it either. So, I mean, it's easy to blame Muslims, it's easy to blame gays, it is easy to blame everyone else, but to look inside their own conscience and see what is happening in the United States, it's extraordinary. We really are stunned at what is happening in the United States. I want to read, to uplift all of us. I'm sitting in Toronto here. Rob Oliphant, who is a openly gay member of Parliament of Canada, elected from one of these constituencies in Toronto. Yesterday, he tweeted, I am an openly gay MP elected by the largest Muslim community in Canada. And that has been retweeted 3.5 million times since yesterday and has had 3.7 million likes. Look at the stark difference in Toronto and what is happening in the United States. Right. I say that in great sadness as a friend of America.
Richard, let's go back to what President Obama can or should be doing. He's come under a lot of criticism from Donald Trump, who says that he's being too politically correct in responding to this tragedy. I mean, how difficult is it for someone like President Obama to walk that fine line between keeping the American people safe, on the one hand, and turning this into a complete surveillance state on the other?
No, I think that's the hardest balance this president has to make. And here's the thing. Republicans over and over and over again have called for the president to say radical Islam or radical jihadis. Well, today, the top Democratic nominee and the new leader of the party, of the Democratic Party, called it out. She said radical Islam. And I guarantee you, the world didn't open up, manna didn't rain down from heaven, ISIS didn't disappear. Because that's not how you deal with ISIS. What Donald Trump, what Republicans lack is the basic understanding of what's happening in the region. Right? You can't go over there and carpet bomb them and think you're going to solve terrorism in the Western world. You've got to understand that this is a tribal region. There's multiple tribes, there's multiple leaders. And what we have done is we sort of came up with a coloring book and tried to recolor the Middle East. And this is the impact of it. Right? But that doesn't speak to what happened at Pulse nightclub.
That's not the only thing we did. That's not the only thing we did. Yes. No, that's not the only thing we did. Since the 2000 invasion of Iraq, that whole invasion occupation has led to the death and killing of 1 million Iraqi innocent civilians.
Right.
That's not a joke. 4 million Iraqis have been displaced. That's not the only thing. Then in next door country in Syria, where this butcher Assad has been massacring his own people, 250,000, this is one of the greatest failures of the Obama administration, that we have refused to lift a finger. It's not our problem.
No, I agree.
It's not our problem. Let them die. Then what happens if 5 million Syrians or thereabouts turn up on the doors of Europe, and we have a wave of xenophobia in Europe. And
I completely agree with that, and I think what Donald Trump will do is he'll continue to double down on that. I think what he's asking for, what he said in that speech today, I would argue, is close to what Rwanda-style discrimination or Japanese internment camp discrimination. Right. Excuse me. And I think we've got to sort of move away from that. And if we think about those individuals who lost their lives at Pulse nightclub, they were the antithesis of all of that. They believed in love, acceptance, diversity, and it's the opposite of Donald Trump.
Okay, very quickly, we've got 10 seconds. Kevin, go ahead.
On the issue, on the issue of guns, let's also remember that President Obama did try to do something after the Connecticut school shooting, and he was foiled by Republicans in the Congress who killed that measure. So he has tried.
We are going to have to leave it there. Thanks to all of you for joining us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. We leave you now with some powerful images as Americans mourn those lost to another mass shooting. I'm Arlen Blyden in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.